Welcome back to Weekly Briefing. Joining me in studio is Cherise Trump, Executive Director at Speech First. Derek Hawley, member of Project 21 and President of Reaching America. And Dr. Shay Bradley Farrell, President of the Counterpoint Institute for Policy Research and Education. President Joe Biden rambled on about the so-called climate crisis this past week, and during a congressional hearing, Biden Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg has again suggested prices are a good thing because it will force everyday Americans to accept a transition to the green energy agenda.
And guess what? The first frost, you know what was happening? You had to put on your windshield wipers to get literally the oil slick off the window. That's why I and so damn many other people I grew up have cancer.
The more pain we are all experiencing from the high price of gas, the more benefit there is for those who can access electric vehicles.
So Derek, we are learning that Joe Biden doesn't in fact have cancer. He has tested, however, this week positive for COVID-19. But back to the topic at hand. Is it just me, or does the word transition take on a much more negative connotation nowadays under the Biden administration?
Absolutely, as we transition. And so the thing about it is, what the other thing that Buttigieg said was, for those people who can afford electric vehicles. Most of Americans cannot afford electric vehicles. There was a study just a couple of years ago that said over 90% of the people who purchase electric vehicles make over $100,000 a year. Most Americans do not make that kind of money. And the thing about it is, if you recall, Joe Biden on the campaign trail, his whole message was, we're going to shut down the oil and gas industry.
That's right.
And that's exactly what they're doing right now. And for Buttigieg to make a statement like that, it just goes to show just how out of touch with reality this administration is with what's going on in America.
And you have John Kerry, the climate czar, jetting around in his private jet while he's telling all of us we need to give up our cars and bike everywhere.
Derek's right. They are so disconnected from what's really going on with American citizens. I mean, does Joe Biden, is his motorcade electric? Have I missed that somewhere? They seem thrilled that gas prices are so high and that we're struggling with this. They won't produce oil in our country. We're going to Saudi Arabia to beg for it, and this is the worst time ever to push the green energy deal on Americans with this 40-year record inflation.
And to add insult to injury with the Middle East trip, the purpose of it, ostensibly, while the Biden administration said it wasn't about oil, we know that's what they talked about. And to add insult to injury, the Crown Prince announced that he's not going to increase production whatsoever. And now you can see him high-fiving Vladimir Putin.
It's awful, and I call them bi-coastal elitists, because they're so out of touch with Americans, and so it's just unfortunate that we're in this situation with inflation at 9%. Okay, gas prices and electricity has doubled since this man has been in office, and the only reprieve I think we want to have is when midterm elections come, where we have a lame duck president and we can stop whatever it is they're trying to do right now.
I have no doubt that electric vehicles, let's just talk about electric cars. Electric cars seem to be the way of the future. It seems like in 10, 20 years from now, everyone's going to be driving an electric car. But right now, it's a very inequitable thing. It's not something that everyone can afford, and it's something that really cuts out the affordability factor.
There's also a huge waiting list. I know people who have been waiting almost a year for their electric vehicle because the materials just aren't there. So it's inaccessible as well to people who can even afford it.
That's the point, the materials. Because the materials that these electric vehicles are made of, over 85% of the car comes from fossil fuels. So how are we going to shut down the industry that's providing the resources to build electric vehicles? It makes no sense.
And on top of that, most of those parts are coming from China. On the heels of President Biden's trip to the Middle East, Russian President Vladimir Putin visited Tehran. And he did so in a way to strengthen cooperation between Russia and Iran. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei criticized the NATO alliance led by the U.S. and said the West was working to halt the growth of a strong and independent Russia. Dr. Farrell, I mean, are we talking about Saudi Arabia that is now, no, I'm sorry, not Saudi Arabia. Are we talking about an Iran that is teaming up with Russia? Is this just sending a message to the world that they are potentially teaming up, or are they actually teaming up?
No, they're teaming up. I mean, Iran has promised to send several hundred armed drones to Russia and to send their military personnel there to train people in Russia on how to use these drones. And that's really a way to influence the country and infiltrate the country even more. So we're seeing, you and I have talked about this before, alliances around the world between our adversaries continually strengthened since Biden took office. And it's, of course, not a coincidence that as soon as Biden was rejected in Saudi Arabia, that Russia made this $40 billion gas deal with Iran. Russia, at the same time, last week, closed down Nord Stream 1. It's reopened with a reduced amount of gas going through it. All other pipelines from Russia to Europe have reduced their amount of gas. So Europe is bracing for this energy crisis. And I know you said last time I'm not supposed to talk about this, but ironically, Ukraine is also piping Russian gas through its country, and I don't fault it. They're also reliant on this business.
And I didn't say you can talk about it to censor you. I was saying, like, this is an unpopular narrative, right?
I know, you were teasing me when you said that. But here's the thing, Ukraine has brought legal action against Russia for reducing the amount of natural gas coming through those pipes and violating their contract, if you can believe that. Recently.
We're going to fight in court and on the battlefield. Oh.
Yes.
All right. Well, they don't have... we certainly don't have a lot of insight into what our adversaries are doing now, despite what our intelligence community is telling us. And that's something that should concern every American. When you have an administration who has such a twisted worldview about what our adversaries are up to, or has such a clear misunderstanding about what they're up to, you see meetings like this taking place, and suddenly deals are being made between America's worst enemies.
Russia and China, oil and gas deals have also strengthened, $80 billion 10-year oil and gas deals. So yes, you're correct.
And at some point you wonder how much of it is being done on purpose. And that's where we talk about the money, Derek. I know that we can talk about that a little later. New York City Mayor Eric Adams is experiencing that there is in fact a downside to opening the border and allowing illegal aliens to pour across our southern border and into his city.
This is a real burden on New Yorkers as we're trying to do the right thing. We already, as I stated, we already have an overburdened shelter system. So now we're talking about, as you stated, food, clothing, school. This is going to impact our schools because we do not turn away individuals because they're undocumented.
Sharice, it's amazing that you hear those words coming out of this very liberal mayor who ostensibly should be on the side of Democrats supporting the flow of illegal immigration. And here he is saying this is such a burden on our city. Right. It's such a micro look into what's happening on a macro level.
This goes back to what Derek was saying earlier, the extreme disconnect with what's going on in this country amongst the coastal elites. And the folks who are not necessarily on the border are now starting to finally feel the brunt of what's going on with the lack of good immigration policies in this country. And honestly, I always find the euphemisms impressive because they try to sugarcoat it and they try really hard to weasel their way out of talking about how terrible the situation is right now. Millions upon millions of undocumented immigrants are coming across the border, and literally no one's doing anything to stop it. In fact, they're encouraging it. And so this is something that has been going on for years, and it started during the Trump administration, and he was putting policies in place to stop it. And then all of those policies were repealed after Biden came into office, and it just kind of opened the floodgates. I think everyone knew that was happening.
You raise a really great point that is not talked about as often, and that is the euphemism use, the euphemisms that are used to describe the crisis. And that is when you seize the language, when we seize the terminology, and you say it's not an illegal, it's an undocumented individual or undocumented worker, suddenly you're changing the entire discourse. This is debate 101.
And a perfect example of that is the narrative Biden's put forth of humane, orderly, and safe. Right. On all of my investigative trips down to the border, I have observed illegal immigrants who have come over actually believing that Biden had invited them to come and they're going to get an apartment and food and money, yes, and they end up sleeping on park benches and stealing. I've talked to the business owners, going into businesses, breaking in, stealing to survive.
Right.
So this narrative is a lie. And something also to your point, Charisse, I have found out is, so for 22 years, the CBP was actually reporting the number of illegal immigrants crossing the border that have died crossing. Since Biden took office, they no longer report it. But my talking to counties on the border, we still are collecting numbers, and here's why they're not reporting it. They're so much higher. And you know why? We've talked about this. Illegal immigrants have to collaborate with the cartels to come in. Coyotes, in the words of a police officer, a local police officer, they have no regard for human life.
No.
And that is such an awkward linguistic, I think, problem that the White House is facing. They don't want to cross that line into saying this is a humanitarian issue. And yet they have always said that this was a humanitarian issue. Now that they're in power, it's no longer really a humanitarian issue. This is more about compassion
It's horrible, actually.
and that we do have control over the border, and it's really just outright lying.
When you find a dozen people dead in the back of a tractor trailer,
Yes.
that's a humanitarian issue.
Yes, it is.
Again, this administration is disconnected from the reality of what's happening in this country right now. And it's awful. I can't wait till November.
I think a lot of people feel the same way, Derek. When we return, we discuss the leaked audio of a top company official feeling the heat from Democrat politics. Who and what was said? Coming up.